Greetings to all virtually present here today. My name is Prince David Ibokwe, and today I am your host in transitioning today's episode 18 and 21 panel discussions of the servant leader. It brings me great pleasure to be here again, but as a host in today's topic on arts and culture, a facility of expression that is often blindsided by the public spectrum. So that being said, under the hashtag first time voters, we have 5 individuals that will be articulating their observation on the lives of Barbara Masekela and Brigitte Mbala. And these individuals and how these individuals impacted arts and culture in South Africa. And to the audience, it would be very much appreciated if you could drop any questions to the panelists in the chat. So that being said, I would like to introduce to you your panelists. Puti.
Good morning, everyone. The name goes by Puti, and I am a 20-year-old UCT student studying theatre and performance. My pronouns go by he and him, and the interview that I'm conducting is activist Barbara Masekela.
Thank you, Puti. Next, we have Gina.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Georgina Walter. I'm 20 years old and I'm currently studying in Cape Town. I'm studying a BA in Theatre and Performing Arts, but I'm originally from Johannesburg. My pronouns are she and her, and I watched the interview for Barbara Masekela. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. Next up, we have Ambali.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ambali Williams. I'm a 20-year-old student at the University of Cape Town, born and bred in Cape Town. I'm currently in my second year of politics and law. My pronouns are she, her. And the interview I'll be discussing today will be on Barbara.
Thank you. Next up, we have Nick.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nicholas Kruger. I am a 20-year-old student currently doing their second year in BA Theatre Performance, specializing in acting. My pronouns are he, they, and I will be speaking about Brigitte Mabandla.
Thank you so much, Nick. Lastly, we have Edith.
Is Edith Mugadza. I am a second-year-old student at the University of Cape Town, studying law and psychology, originally from Johannesburg. And I will be covering Brigitte Mabandla.
Thank you so much, Edith, for that. So we're about to start, guys, and I would like to ask my panelists on what they think arts and culture means to them by definition, and what it means in a democracy, and what has the role arts and culture has in South Africa. First of all, I would ask Georgina to go first.
Thank you, Prince. So for me, I think arts and culture are extremely important in any socio-political environment. Even though a democracy is seen as an environment in which all persons are free, I suppose there are always factors there are always factors in which individuals are binded or not free. So this leads me to say why arts and culture are so important, because they allow for a platform in which citizens can express their woes or excitement about their environment or their current living situation in a way which teaches, informs, and entertains an audience, as well as distancing them from the subject matter, which I think is vital, because, I mean, if I have a problem with, for example, the government, and I try to have a conversation with, say, Edith about it, and Edith's telling me, no, I completely disagree with you, but say I put a play on, and I'm like, this is my problem, and then Edith's like, oh, okay, I can see how, maybe it's another way to get your point across, which I think is vital in any environment. And also freedom of speech. I think theatre and freedom of speech are tied. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. A platform of expression, I feel like that's a great opportunity for individuals to come across and allow their voice to be heard. Thanks, Gina. Next, I would have Nick too.
Just to go with what Gina has been talking about, yes, I completely agree that it is. I think I'd like to start off by saying that we as people have a psychological need for expression. We can't let things that affect us sit in our bodies or sit in our minds and fester, because it's just frankly detrimental to your own health. So I believe that we all need a way of freely expressing our woes and our happiness in wherever we are, in whatever space we occupy. And that could be for personal enrichment, and it could be for political and sociocultural ends at the same time. I mean, looking at South Africa's rich history in theatre, and specifically protest theatre,
Yes.
and learning about how how these movements played a part in dismantling formal apartheid, you begin to look at and understand why freedom of expression is incredibly important. I'd like to end off by saying that it is always the first sign that there is something wrong, something rotten in a society that muzzles its artists and people who choose to express in so many ways. As soon as journalists, writers, playwrights, painters can't express what they want to, then you know that something is happening in a society, that there is pressure from those in power pushing down on those who don't, to silence them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, on that significant bypass on arts and culture. Next, I would have Mbali.
Sheesh, I don't think there's anything that my fellow panelists haven't already articulated so beautifully, but arts and culture, I think I go by definition, has to be an expression. And I think that it's so encompassing that that mode of expression can be whatever it is that anybody deem fit or cathartic for them, you know. And I think it's brilliant that it had such an active role, and it still does, in liberation and in struggle. I know from watching the interview on Barbara at Masekela, thinking about how she's been an advocate for it forever, and because her family was so encouraging of artistic expression. You know, her brother's the amazing and late trumpeter Hugh Masekela, to have grown up in a household with music and emphasis on culture and on art is so necessary. It really is what keeps a person sane. And I think what a lot of people don't really realize is that it isn't necessarily an exercise through a discipline. You know, you don't have to have studied for it. You don't have to have been the best singer, actor, dancer. But arts and culture is what makes us full. You know, when we feed the political, the social, the economic parts of ourselves and of society, we need to feed arts and culture just as much. It needs to be emphasized. It needs to be celebrated much more, because I mean, as an exercise, it's so liberating, and it's so, I mean, it's free, it's cathartic, it's therapy, it's so necessary.
Thank you, Mbali. I think you and Nick had the same approach in saying that one cannot hold in what one thinks about a specific problem, you know. So if one just focus on one sphere, for example, financial sphere, right? You are not same, you understand? So one needs to articulate in all spheres that one can, you know. And next, I would have Edith on her definition of what arts and culture has in South Africa.
Arts and culture, particularly when looking at it from a democratic space and its value to democracy, I keep thinking about the great storytelling potential that it holds. I think from looking from playwrights to journalists, I think arts and culture is this vehicle for holding the stories and bringing forward the narratives of our society today. They often say, like, theatre holds a mirror up to society, and arts as a whole does this, in order for us to reflect as a people where we're going, what we're doing, what we look like. And I think often theatre in particular holds that potential in that it can make us look at what we are, but it presents it to us in a way that we can look at it a bit more objectively than we do when we're in the middle of it, you know? So I think it's particularly sad when you see people degrading the role that arts and culture has for our society as a whole, when in essence, arts and culture is the lifeblood of a society. It speaks to the very humanness. It holds the stories of the individuals who have been, who currently are, and it speaks to our potential to be as a country and as a nation.
Thank you so much, Edith, for that. And then lastly, we have Puti.
For me, what I perceive arts and culture to be is a vast and gaping set of practice of beliefs, goals, and ideas that is embedded in a group of diverse people within a country. For me, arts and culture is a platform that brings people of different backgrounds and different spheres or different journeys and stages in their lives together. And I personally believe that arts and culture is a mirror for society to look at how arts and culture was a political tool to counteract against. And it's a crucial notion that arts and culture isn't something, as my fellow panelist Ambali stated, that it's not something discipline that you have to be trained in. I mean, arts and culture is embedded in every person's unique being, and helping express that or exude that helps bring a certain sense of unison or unity in an egalitarian society.
Thank you so much, Puti, on that observation and what you think the definition of arts and culture is in South Africa. On my side, arts and culture, it's a great platform to express one's opinions that is occurring in the public spectrum. And I feel like it's a necessity for one to apply oneself in that facility, you know, because as creatives, we are the future, you know. You can't have someone work for you who is not creative, because the outcome won't be as much as one would be to be expected. So I would like to thank my panelists for that great introduction, what they think arts and culture is and what role it has in South Africa. Next, I would have Gina to take a deeper dive into the life of Barbara Masekela, sorry for that, and how her life impacted arts and culture in South Africa. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you. So personally, I really enjoyed learning about Barbara, very much so because I am a very cultural person. And so this has been one of my favorite interviews to watch because I really resonated with her.
Yes.
So she comes from a very cultural family. Her brother is Hugh Masekela, the famous South African trumpeter who wrote a lot of anti-apartheid songs. Her father was a social worker. And also, no, her mother was a social worker. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Her mother was a social worker. I'm so sorry, guys. So her mother was a social worker, and she spoke so many languages. So even from a young age, she was introduced to, because I mean, South Africa has so many different languages,
Yes.
and she was introduced to so many of them, which really is such a huge advantage in life because you're able to communicate with almost the entirety of the country. Also, her father was a sculptor. And he was originally from Limpopo. So and she speaks about how her house was always filled with books and music, a lot of music. And to me, that just sounds like a very happy and fulfilled childhood, just in terms of the environment in which you're in, because I suppose arts and culture always creates an environment in which you're able to express yourself. And I know personally for me, that's also been the case. So as I said, she was exposed to so many different types and aspects of South African culture, which is amazing. But I think another note is that So she remembers feeling isolated and left out when she was a child because of her parents. So and I suppose she says her family didn't fit into any one group, right? And I suppose as a child, through arts and culture, that was a way in which she could express her feelings around her, and maybe what fueled her like and her energy for this. And also her attraction towards equality. I mean, if you look at her and her work and what she's done throughout the years, she's used arts and culture, but for the equality of South Africans, which I personally think is amazing. And like, I see her as like an inspiration and a role model personally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. On that note, Gina, do you have any quotes that you would like to dissect within the interview?
Yeah, actually, now that you mentioned it, I do have one. So the quote is, fostering unity and growth through culture. And I actually don't think I can elaborate more on that, because I think it like fits kind of perfectly into what I've just been saying about how she's used the culture around her to create unity in South Africa. So thank you.
Thank you. Next we would have Puti to take a deeper dive, and what do you think how Barbara life impacted the arts and culture sector in South Africa?
Just to go back to what Gina has already iterated, was during her childhood, she was already born and bred into a family of artists. I mean, having a brother who is one of South Africa's pioneers in the jazz artist spectrum, and having a father as a sculptor and a mother as a social worker. She comes from a family of people who are talented and rooted deep into their cultures. And she was exposed to a lot of languages in South Africa and had like a vast diversity of her parents' backgrounds that she was enthralled and captivated by. With this being said, she often used, like Georgina said, that she often felt so isolated because she was not, or her family was not fixated into one group. They were seen as outsiders. So this was a turning point in her life, and how she became so enthralled and captivated by the arts and culture that she wanted to pursue this as a career, thus going into being the ambassador of the culture in the United States of America for South Africa. And throughout her life, she'd focus on, striving for an acceleration in arts and culture, let it emerge, let it be not overlooked, kept in the sidelines, let it be emphasized, to be seen as a political tool to help disband any form of oppression or discrimination. So that really heavily impacted on her principles in life and her career-wise.
Thank you, Puti. On that note, Puti, is there anything that, you as an artist, do you think there's anything that you can take from Barbara and use it to accentuate your performativity?
Oh, yes. So one quote that I drew from her interview was how South Africa is not one-dimensional. And I really resonated with that, because South Africa has this contentious, colorful, diverse history that it can't be confined into being one-dimensional. We have different backgrounds and different cultures that really are exuding and representing South Africa as a whole. And I personally feel that that was a perfect way to sum up what South Africa is all about, looking at it from a specific perspective. So yes.
Thank you for that perspective on dimensionality in terms of one's background and how that background is the foundation of arts and culture. Thank you for that. Last, but we have Ambali. Ambali, I would like to ask you, what has Barbara done significantly to you as an individual of intellectual thought?
Thank you for that question. I think the parts of her interview that captivated me the most was her political prominence and how she fought during the struggle, how she was exiled, how she traveled for work and for her studies. And I mean, she is one of the most esteemed and like decorated woman in politics, which I think is so aspirational, because that is the avenue that I want to exercise in, and that is the industry that I want to work in. But something that really resonated with me from the interviews and just reading about her life's work is her diplomacy, and how she's been one of South Africa's ambassadors, you know, for so many years. And she's represented us in the United States, she's represented us at UNESCO, and just to see that a woman as decorated as her, to achieve everything that she has, without compromise. She didn't necessarily have to, you know, go along the lines of academia, and obviously this informs her arts and culture and intellect, but it wasn't all just books and studies. She emphasized how important it was that arts and culture be incorporated into societies, into nations, and how it should be represented. You know, she was head of arts and culture for the ANC, which is, I mean, it's remarkable. I think there's so many significant strides and accomplishments that Barbara has exemplified in her life's work, but genuinely her non-compromise on her passion in every sphere that she's worked in, both as a person who was educated and an educator, is really aspirational.
Thank you so much, Ambali, for that. I would like to ask Edith to introduce the life of Brigitte, if you would like to do that, please. Thank you.
So Brigitte Mabandla worked within politics. She first was introduced to politics and became politically aware in varsity, where she joined SASCO. She eventually then had to leave and go into exile, and she went and continued her studies abroad, and she got her LLB. Upon her return, she works particularly within children and women liberation and their rights, working within the Constitution to work on the protection of their rights. For arts and culture, she worked as the Deputy Minister of Arts and Culture from 1995 to 2002, if I remember correctly. And under that time period, she oversaw the return of Sarah Bardman to South Africa from Paris, and also discussions on the Anglo-Boer War and shifting that narrative from just being a war between the Anglos and the Boers to being something that impacted Africans as a whole, and looking at our impact. I think that event in particular shows her impact on the arts and cultures, in that she prioritized the importance of seeing Africans within arts and culture and uplifting African arts and culture and indigenous arts. And yeah.
Thank you, Edith. Edith, is there anything you can take from a woman of excellence like Brigitte?
I think obviously, as someone who studied law and someone who's now currently studying law, that in itself, I think, is impressive, and to see how she used that to impact the lives of children and women, but also to see how she used that to work within the artistic field. I think the idea of bringing Africans into focus within African arts and culture is incredibly important, especially when we're dominated by a Western field that will try and wash us out of our own narratives and our own history. I think it's incredibly valuable that she brought us back into focus, and it reminds us as academics, but as people, as lovers and takers of arts and cultures, how important it is to refocus African narratives.
Thank you for that. Yes, it's very important to have that refocus on one's foundation and not be swept away by Westernization. Thank you so much, Edith, for that. Last but not least, we have Nicholas, and I would like for him to give an introduction on what he heard throughout the interview with Daniel Plykes. Thank you.
Thank you, Prince. I would like to expand upon what Edith was referring to in how Brigitte Mabandla, in her capacity as Deputy Minister of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology, was in her role, and how she was instrumental in returning Sarah Bardman's remains to South Africa. I think I would like to highlight the importance of such an important step in restoring dignity to South Africans. Is that for those who don't know, Sarah Bardman was a Khoi woman who was effectively kidnapped by colonizers in the 17th century and taken to Europe to put on display in what amounts to a zoo. And her body would later become would later be used to create some of the founding principles of what we understand today as the pseudoscience of I'm missing the word, but scientific racism. They used her as the basis to justify their racist, insane policies of how, thank you, Edith, eugenics, to justify their policy and philosophy of eugenics. And what makes it so important for her return is that an African woman took on the French government in such a way that the French parliament was there having discussions about should they even release this woman's body, should they even give her back dignity to return her to her land. And I think, and there's something important there in Sarah Bardman returning to her land, being her remains being interred in her land and not in some foreign land which her ancestors never knew. So there's something important in reclaiming something that is from our home here in South Africa and taking it back here and giving her remains dignity in her own home. And the quote she makes in reference to that is, make those regarded as small the most important. That is what Brigitte Mabandla said during the interview. And she was speaking at the time she was speaking specifically about the Khoisan people in South Africa who have inhabited Southern Africa for almost 1,000 years, that have suffered with some for half of that time under European colonization. And she was talking about how Khoi people are South African, and if we can't respect them, then how do we respect South Africans as a whole? And her bringing back Sarah Bardman's remains was her fulfilling that promise.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for that collaboration that we see with Sarah Bardman. So we have a question from Cameron in the group chat, and the question goes as follows. You guys have brought up protest theatre. What do you think of South Africans' use of protest theatre in achieving democracy? Gina, would you like to elaborate more on this question?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Prince. So I personally love protest theatre. I think it is such a fantastic tool for enacting social change in communities, especially when you have a government which really limits the ways in which you can, like formally or more conventionally, like you're limited, you're oppressed through those conventions. And I think theatre is one way which is really amazing in kind of battling that. I suppose it kind of breaks the blissful ignorance of an audience. One very popular example in South Africa is Athol Fugard. I mean, I suppose everyone knows who he is. He's very well known, especially internationally. But I suppose I do have a little bit of a problem with Athol Fugard as well, in that he was a white man who was telling the stories of so many other people. And yes, he was, like, I suppose, using his white body to project and enhance Black voices. But I think a lot of places, especially overseas in America and the UK, really just say, oh, it's Athol Fugard wrote these plays. When the case is, it's not just Athol Fugard. There's so many other people who were a part of it, but it's just kind of his name was slapped in front of the book. But yes, those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Gina. Gina, on that, do you think it's acceptable for a white body to articulate the background of a Black body?
No, I think maybe historically there's been a place, I suppose, it's a difficult question. So like historically maybe, but now definitely not. definitely me as a white woman, I'm never going to be able to hear someone else's story and tell it as if it were my own or create it into something, because I have a different experience of life and a different way of viewing the world, which is not going to be the same, and it's not going to be shown in the same way as if a Black body were to do that.
Thank you, Gina, for that cognitive bias. Mbali, would you like to contribute on what Gina has said? And could you also please elaborate on the definition of what protest theatre is?
Gladly. Protest theatre is a type of theatre that is aimed at spreading or changing an ideology of its masses, of its audiences. And protest theatre is often used as a convention during times of repression. So protest theatre was very prevalent during apartheid. I myself, being a drama student at heart, and one that partook in it in high school, remembers the impact and the gorgeous literatures that we had studied on protest theatre. And before I get into that though, I really like, and I'd love to affirm the point that Gina made about what can only be articulated as like a white savior complex, right? And how esteemed people like Athol Fugard, whose name now is world-renowned, quite literally, had to exercise his privilege as a white man by putting Black stories at the front, because he would not be persecuted to the same extent as his Black peers, right? And it is tricky, you know, this conversation of white saviorism, especially in the arts, and that also goes as far as like the artistic license, and like how far are we allowed to use and portray and tell stories that may not be our own. But I think that's a conversation for a different day. However, I think about the impact that protest theatre has had in democracy, and how it really is a very, I think it can be utilized in a way to push, not even push, but for like advocate for an agenda or a political ideology in a way that is inexpensive and that is very accessible. A lot of protest theatre was workshop theatre. A lot of protest theatre was like, what is it? I think it's poor theatre. Yeah, I think that's actually how it is articulated. And how this managed to reach masses and audiences and people who grew up in poor communities, in impoverished communities that didn't have access to things like technology. You know, a lot of the anti-apartheid movement actually was spread through word of mouth, through protest action, through the radio, you know, Black radio. And for those who did not have access to it, to be able to watch or attend a play or a musical that is basically advocating for equality, that's advocating for the things that you can resonate with personally, I think is a beautiful exercise of getting people on your side. And especially in terms of how it also managed to reach audiences that were ignorant, because you will still hear today white people tell you that while living through apartheid, they did not know that it was going on, or that they were ignorant of the experiences of Black people. You know, they were under this impression that, yes, it's separate, but like, we're all equal, or I don't know what's going on the other side of the highway. And to have them watch that, and to have them witness that, maybe through people like Athol Fugard, who had to get it to those audiences, because he said, as a white person, I need other white people to see this. I need them to know, you know, the detriments of what our government is doing to people of color and to Black people. So it does, you know, it does have it has its goodness, and it has its I don't know, it has its purpose. And I think that I think it achieves that. I really think about it quite often, in fact, and how if we did not have Waza Alberts and islands, you know, then we wouldn't know the experiences of everybody, because storytelling does get I can't even articulate it. I think it does get undermined to the extent that it really does dishearten me that there are things that we do not know and that we might never know, because there are no records of it. And the fact that we still have pieces of literature, that we have theatre that we can watch and reference, keeps that part alive, to say that these people's experiences will be heard and they will be shown.
Thank you, Mbali. Edith, before I get to you, Mbali, I'd like to ask you, do you think that a lack of access with regards to the interviews that you watched on Brigitte and Barbara, do you think that the lack of access to arts and culture platforms heightens the levels of ignorance within our public sector?
That's a very good question. I don't know if it heightens, but I don't think it helps. I don't think it helps that people do not have access to the arts and to cultures, in terms of, I don't know, in terms of like enlightening their own ignorance, because it is accessible nowadays. And what I have found especially is that the most ignorant people are usually the ones who possess the most resources. So I don't think that is a fair estimation. You know, I think ignorance is bliss, but I think that ignorance is also privilege. So I think that while you have your laptops and your computers and your TVs at home, you might choose to never really watch Black art or listen to Black music or read Black literature. You could actively make those decisions every single day with your abundance of resources. Whereas people who do not have those resources, I think it would even be a privilege to want to be knowledgeable of those things, because they need to really deal with what's in front of them, to be perfectly honest, right? Like, I think that would be my priority, in fact. But I don't think it helps. I don't think it helps that arts and culture and art and literature isn't the most accessible, especially in this democracy. Because we don't all have equal access to those types of things, and those really inform us as people and as humanity. So yeah.
Thank you, Mbali, for that perspective. Edith, do you have anything to conclude on what Mbali has to say?
On the idea of, well, in particular with Athol Fugard as the focus, I think it's a very nuanced debate necessarily that is empowered to tell certain stories, particularly when they don't pertain to themselves. I think as more people become more liberated, the line blurs more so. But I think if you're looking at Fugard's example and the context within which he was working with, I do think that there was a great value to be had in a voice like that. I think it was necessary to have someone who had the face of privilege and who had the ability to walk in these spaces and to then tell stories of people who were being oppressed and to tell these stories of universal suffering that were occurring, even if not directly to themselves. Does that bring up questions of white saviorism and whether or not people in privilege really will ever fully understand the stories of Black and oppressed people? It does. It questions whether or not they'll be able to really tell our stories as effectively as they're capable of doing. However, I do think, particularly pertaining to the time in which he existed, there was a great need for his work. Do I wish international audiences had also paid more attention to the people he was workshopping with? Your John Carneys, your Winston and Shaunas? Absolutely. However, I also think that speaks to arts and culture as a whole. And I think in our celebration of it now, I think we also need to look at who it is exactly that we are celebrating, who it is that we're ignoring, and what stories we're ignoring in that time period. Then onto the idea of ignorance that Ambali was speaking on, I have to agree wholeheartedly. I think particularly when you're looking at the digital age and people turning around and saying, I think particularly of last year in June, when we had the Black Lives Matter movement exploding in the US. And I remember I had people who I went to high school with who would turn around all of a sudden and were like, can you explain to me race and racism and stuff? And I was like, okay, I guess if we're finally having this dialogue, sure, let's have it now. But all I could think to myself is the same articles that I'm Googling to tell you about this more effectively, because my experiences aren't a monolith, are the same articles you can be researching. I think it speaks to freedom of expression is so necessary because it allows for information to spread, and hence why it's so vital to democracy. But I think especially as you get to societies that are a little more democratic, and do allow people to have more access to resources, it then becomes a matter of agency of, okay, you've been provided this freedom of expression, the arts and culture is around you, and they're telling the stories of the oppressed, and they're telling the stories of the downtrodden. It then speaks to us as a society to say, okay, why aren't we listening to them? Because they are saying something to us. We can't turn around and say that you don't know what's going on in Palestine, because you can hear what's going on. You can hear the stories, you can read the narratives. You can't say that you don't know what's happening with warfare in Iraq, or the stories of people in, the name of the country is completely eluding me right now, but you can't say you don't know the stories going on around you, because they're there. We just need to listen to them. The arts and cultures are trying to speak to us. We're just not valuing them the way that we ought to, as if they don't play such a crucial role in a democracy.
Thank you, Edith, on that elaboration on your perspective on what Ambali and Nick, Gina even had to say. I would like to ask my panelists one more question, and this question goes on for my panelists to elaborate on the efforts that these two individuals, Barbara and Brigitte, had on arts and culture in South Africa. And with regard to the efforts, is there anything that could have been improved during the era of operation? And I would ask Puti to introduce that question to the audience.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Do you think that there could have been a better doing by them in the area of operation?
I personally feel that with Barbara, she did nothing but promote and show emphasis on cultural appreciation, even when she was in exile due to a political affiliation with the ANC. She spent her time in exile putting forth, promoting arts and culture of South Africa in foreign places. So I personally feel that she did great by so focusing on the notion of arts and culture within South Africa, and there was nothing that was shortlisted or lack thereof with her principles and styles, because I personally felt that she was all for arts and culture of South Africa.
Thank you so much, Puti. I would like to ask Nicholas to conclude on what Puti had to say, and then I would like to jump onto the chat. Thank you, Nick.
Talking about Brigitte Mabandla, I think I think we can all acknowledge the role that she has played in furthering democracy and furthering arts and culture in South Africa. I think there's one particular photo I'd like to, or two actually, that I'd like to focus on, and that's that you will see on the Servant Leader website, is that her standing with her husband and a member of the royal family of Sweden and a South African army officer. And there's something very poignant about a South African and an African being honored by the same people who just 100 years ago were hell-bent on stripping this entire continent of everything, from people to resources, to anything that you can think of. So I like this narrative shift that Africans going to European countries and in the same capacities, with the same level of power and dignity that the Europeans for a long time only afforded to themselves, that now they are forced to give to Africans and South Africans. And there's just something so powerful about that photo, with people from where we are now operating on the same level as those who formerly oppressed South Africans and Africans. Brigitte Mabandla admits herself that the one failure she considers in her career was the closing of the technicons, which to my knowledge were primarily artisan colleges located throughout South Africa that focus mainly on providing practical knowledge to jobs such as plumbing and electricity, And however, I'm not too personally, and I won't speak on it because I'm not too personally clear on some of the negatives of those technicons. But she regards it as a failure in her career.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for that elaboration. I would like to jump to the chat. We have a question from one of our audience. What did you say to people who are tired of learning about South African theatre pieces in schools and universities? Edith, would you like to elaborate on this question?
Thank you. So just twofolds, basically. So the first is this quote of, like, I wish I could like find the original source material, but I know it's one that my grandfather was always very big on. And it's this idea of when you fail to listen to history and learn from it, you're doomed to repeat its mistake. I know it's quite a well-known quote, but I think when it comes to South African theatre of the past, I think it shows us a very clear perspective of where we were. If theatre and the arts hold a merit to society, well, then it shows us what the reflection looked like at that time period. And I think that there is a lot to be learned. I think when you look at any sort of historical catastrophe, it starts off as little steps that didn't seem very consequential at the time. I mean, if you look at Nazism in Germany, that was something that was achieved through democratic processes. It shows us that as strong as our societal constructs seem, and our systems in place seem very legitimate and, you know, hell-bent on like stopping things like that, cracks can appear and they can allow for great atrocities. And I think it is important for us to continue to remember that, to continue to learn from that. And in the second fold, it's this idea of when it comes to social activism and like learning about what continues to hinder others, you're never truly done, you know. I think once you get to a point where you think, okay, well, I've learned everything I need to learn, there is no affected category that I don't understand anymore, you've completely missed the point, right? You will continue to learn for the rest of your life. As a Black South African, I will continue to learn what that means and what that entails as for how I express and how I conduct myself in the world, and also how I treat and interact with others. I think the minute you start saying that we've learned all we need to learn from South African theatre, we don't need to pay attention to it, particularly in universities and schools, which form our academic and intellectual foundations. It's a great tragedy that some people hold that sentiment, that they believe that they've learned all that they need to learn from the arts, when the arts haven't finished teaching us all that they need to teach us. And when there are so many different perspectives that are still unfolding now, there are great playwrights that we still haven't heard from. If you think about some artists who only became famous after their passing, there are people that we still need to learn about and learn from. And I think if we start closing ourselves off to that, that is a great body of knowledge that we're closing ourselves off.
Thank you, Edith, on that beautiful elaboration. On that, with all the historical documentation being documented for us in terms of wealth, when I mean wealth, I mean resources, I mean all these theatre protests, you know. Ambali and Nicholas, what would you say to an individual that in this art facility, do you think that one coming into this facility, do you think it's an easy thing to access these documentations or quote unquote wealth? And do you think as an African artist, do you think that it would be rather difficult to access that wealth?
Please repeat the question.
So what I'm trying to say is that with all the documentation being documented for us as an artist, do you think that in South Africa, that access to that resources, do you think that it would be difficult for an artist to obtain? Like Edith said, that some artists only become famous once they pass on. So do you think that, that being said, it would be difficult for an artist to survive in South Africa?
I mean, I think it would be difficult for an artist to survive anywhere, and just because we have pieces documented and that we have, you know, history and something to show for it. it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to inform our sustainability as artists in South Africa. I think we need to be funded. I think we need to be encouraged. I think that we need to be emphasized to the extent of our sports heroes. Don't get me started on sports. Yeah, I think that there's obviously some like attachment to patriotism, and we love and adore, you know, our likes of the Springboks and what it is that they represent, and we have all of the funding for them. But our playwrights are quite literally starving, and our fashion designers. And I think about everything that Barbara emphasized and advocated for in her interview about how arts and culture needs to be taken as seriously as every other sphere in our government and our budget. And it does. It does, because it has tangible and legitimate, like effects, but good effects. Do you know what I mean? When kids are encouraged to articulate themselves and to be expressive of their feelings and to exercise themselves through devices like dancing and writing and exercising their imagination, like there are great effects of those. Those literally, they act out themselves in everyday life in really positive and beneficial ways. And we're also forgetting that these are people, these are working people who need to make careers out of this, and this is the career of their choice, this is their calling, and we need to emphasize them and affirm them just as much as we are anybody who wants to be a doctor, a lawyer, and something that, you know, we only think as beneficial to like our primal economy. And that's because, you know, as the capitalist that we are, everything has to be with some kind of cross benefit order. Yeah, some kind of, we need a financial compensation, we need like a financial kind of like satisfaction in order to be happy. And I think that your passions should be fueled by those things, but I think that, well, not necessarily fueled by those things, but I think that your passions should allow you to achieve that financial stability, or whatever it is that you want out of it, because it's legitimate and it should be legitimized more.
Thank you, Mbali, for that articulation. Gina, I'd like to ask you if you'd like to add on the stigma that Mbali pointed out.
Yes, I would like to add. So in terms of wealth, I think to achieve this wealth, Prince, you're talking about, I think people need to realize the importance of arts. So as I mentioned before, I'm studying theatre making at UCT. And when I first started studying, and when I got in, and I was telling people I was studying, I have never felt so scared and anxious to start anything in my life, because I was constantly met with, really? How are you going to make money doing that? Are you doing that? Constantly.
Yes.
Constantly. My degree continuously is belittled by people I meet and people around me. I'm told that my degree is not as good as a law degree, an engineering degree, anything else, constantly. And it is so frustrating, because I know that my degree is useful and is so impactful, and that I'm learning so many things outside of what other people are learning. I'm learning group work, I'm learning to like think out of the box. My brain functions, and so does so many other people who are studying my degree, so differently. But people don't see that. People still see it as, oh, this is just a side hobby. Oh, when are you doing your real degree? You know? But I'm studying at the top institution in Africa, and the degree is difficult to get into. I think there's like a 5-10% acceptance rate.
Yes.
You know, and it's frustrating to have to constantly say, my degree is useful and worthy. It is just as worthy as yours. My distinctions are still distinctions, you know? And I think for me, that's where I think the wealth will start, when people start to take it seriously. Because once people start taking my degree as seriously as they take, as Mbali said, sports degrees. I mean, I personally don't have a scholarship for studying theatre, but I know a bunch of people who are playing rugby and other sports who have scholarships. And, you know, how is there money there, but there's no money for an arts program or for like where is the money? Why is it not towards the arts, where it's been proven time and time and time again how it's not just entertainment, it's you can learn, you can enact social change. There's so much more to arts. And if people were to just like step out of their bubble and, you know,
Yes.
they would find that there's so much more to the arts and
Abundance.
culture in
Yes,
South Africa
yes.
than what meets the eye. It's not just Swan Lake and Shakespeare, you know. There's like an emerging South African artistic group, which is just amazing, and people don't focus on it, you know. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Gina. Nick, I would like to ask you on what Gina has just brought forth on the ignorance when it comes to this sector. Do you think that ignorance comes from the public or the government?
I think that historically, arts and culture has been grouped in a lot of people's minds under the guise of entertainment, that we're entertainers and nothing more than such. And to be frank, I do enjoy entertaining people. I suppose what I'd like to do later on is not just to affect some change in some way, but quite frankly, I would like to have a laugh every now and then. I would like to sit and watch a play and say, this was entertaining for whatever reason I decide to find it entertaining. But it's almost as if it's some sort of, like, it's diminutive to consider us entertainers of what we really do. And I'd also like to echo what Gina has been talking about, and what Putti and you yourself, David, have also been have also felt when coming into this degree, that we were ridiculed. We were scolded by our parents. Why aren't you doing a BCom? Why aren't you doing an LLB? And there's definitely worth in those degrees, but the matter of the fact is that we are a degree. We're getting a BA qualification just like everyone else. So I don't understand what people are missing out on. And the thing is that what we do is what keeps people coming back to do what everything. I mean, like, let me put it this way: music, art, and everything that falls under that guise is what I believe that really keeps people churning out to do their daily routines. Why would I keep going back to my 9-to-5 office job if I can't go back and listen to my favorite music artist who worked hours and hours and hours to produce that work? For instance, it's a small little example, but even the films that we watch are people that work through our profession, whether it be people who are working in the lighting, in the sound, through the editing, through the actual acting, through figuring out the composition of scenes that a director would do. There are so many bits and bobs and pieces and people that go into making what entertains us, using that word, and what really like keeps us alive as people. So I don't understand why we don't get the same kind of appreciation that, you know, the Springboks do, and good for the Springboks, I guess, but yeah.
Thanks, Nick, on that. Putti, I would like to ask you, with regards to what Nick has said, do you think that the success rate of universities keeping money back is way higher for arts than for sports?
Yes, definitely. As Nicholas and Gina and Bali have really reiterated, is the fact that arts and culture is often ridiculed, it's often sidelined and overlooked because there's no generating of wealth and money there. You can't monetize arts and culture because what is it? Sports is the one that brings in the wealth and boosts the economy of the country. I mean, I can't explain to you how many times my parents would worry about, you know, this degree, are you sure you're gonna get money after this? Like, because like I've heard other parents talk about how their kids who have finished their 4-year degree in theatre performance and they're still unemployed, whereas a sports student who got a scholarship finished their degree and are already now trend-setting sports activities. They're now touring around the world. They're getting their income, they're getting the popularity. But for us, we put at a standstill because universities fail to give us sufficient funding in terms of scholarships, in terms of the activities broadcasted and put out there are very, very limited for the people of arts. And considering how arts and culture is seriously a political tool that helps create that political paradigm shift from the 1994 into a democratic state,
Mm-hmm.
yet it's the very same arts and culture that is ignored.
Mm.
It baffles my mind. So I honestly feel that our Minister of Arts and Culture, Natim Tetwa, is, I'm not sure how to even put this, isn't necessarily evaluating
Mm-hmm.
this dire situation that arts and culture is facing. And I feel like us as the youth, we really need to fight against this. It's something else if you all bark and no bites, but we actually need to take action.
Thank you so much, Pootie, on that. Mbali, would you like to add what Pootie has said?
I could sit here and talk about all of this for ages because I mean, I think it's a conversation that
Yes.
like it absolutely needs to be had. It's so necessary. But I was thinking about how I just think the irony of people not being advocates for arts and culture or not really like valuing them are also some of the biggest consumers of art. Like it ceases to amaze me. I think about how we can speak democracy, right? And how protest theatre really did have a huge role to play in catalyzing the fact that we have the liberation that we do right now. But
Mm-hmm.
also the extent of resources and information that we get in arts. I think about how last year during something like Black Lives Matter that
Yeah.
was quite prominent in the USA during June after George Floyd was
Crossing.
on camera. I think about the watch lists and the books that people were recommending because I mean, yes, you're going to want to talk to your every witch and other like Black friend about their experience and can they inform you, but everything that you can learn, like Edith said, was on
Mm-hmm.
the internet or in
Exactly.
resources. So people are watching documentaries upon documentaries and films and reading books, but still cannot put two and two together about how we need to necessitate things like this because they teach us human skills. It teaches us
Mm-hmm.
humanity. Arts and culture gives us
Team.
humanity. You can't get that in engineering. You cannot get that in law. And you watch, okay, me and Edith are not going to be employed as soon as we graduate with our law degree. I mean, our parents want to scream from the rooftops how esteemed they are that their kids are going to be doctors and accountants and lawyers, but it is oversaturated. These industries are oversaturated. The one thing that our degrees aren't going to teach us is creativity. And that is where Nicholas and Pootie and you, Prince, and Gina come in. You guys are in an industry that will forever be evolving because it teaches humanity. And everything that we study now is, I mean, self-regulated by humans, but we need people like you. We need artists like yourselves because I mean, you guys equip us with everything that we can't really get in a textbook and that we can't study in a degree. So suffice it to say, and sorry to spoil the party for everybody who doesn't think that arts and culture are necessitated, but you need it because these youth are going to be raising this country and you want your kids to be informed. You want them to be artistic. You want them to be expressive. I mean, those are all absolutely necessitated skills. That is why we do arts and culture in preschool. We're not doing engineering or woodwork in preschool. Like,
Yeah.
that is why it starts in the developing stages. And that is why it needs to continue to be emphasized and encouraged.
Thank you so much, Mbali, for that perspective. Gina, would you like to ask or would you like to add anything? And
Yeah,
I'll ask
if I
you can boost you after this. Sorry.
yes, no, it's okay. Yes, please, I would like to add, just on what Ambali was saying. So, for example, I mean, if you study computer science, and all those people who study computer science, they'll say, "Oh, humanities sucks. What are you doing with a humanities degree?" But they're the same
Mhm.
people who, when they make an app, they need me because they can make the app, but how are they gonna know what people like or know how it's
Exactly.
gonna reflect to people, you know? And they don't see that. Like, people in humanities are that like link, you know, that which is so important, so important. Secondly, I'd like to go back to Puti's point on sports because I was just, as he was speaking, I was just thinking about how old boys, that, you know, that term. So, okay, I'm from Joburg,
Mhm.
so I'm going to use a Joburg example. So there's two schools, KES and JP. And these schools are funded so heavily from old boys, so heavily, and they are very sports heavy schools, you know. And it's almost as if, I think Ambali gave the point of, you know, you studying, you at UCT for rugby scholarship, and you're going to get employed.
Yes.
Oh, maybe it was Puti. You're going to get a rugby scholarship straight after you go out, right? But you know, that's going to happen because you're going to go to a job interview, and the old guy who's there, who probably went to some same old boys school, is going to say, oh my gosh, you know, I played rugby there and you play rugby. Oh my gosh, look at us bonding already, you know, because it's the old boys who are still sitting in power and not opening their eyes to, oh, okay, Gina, so you did art, you know, that could be diversity in this institution, but they kind of just stick with the same, you know?
Yeah. Thanks, Gina, for that. Edith, would you like to add what Gina has said?
Conversation on the importance of the arts. I kept thinking about what Ambali was saying about how the Springboks can always somehow find this funding, you know, come rain, come thunder, come recession, no matter what. Like, you've never heard of a year where we're like, sorry guys, we're just not gonna have the Springboks this year. And all I could think to myself was like, I can't name who it was that was in like the first Olympics. Like, I don't know who started it. I know it had something to do with Greece, and maybe that's just because it's not the trivia that I know. I'm sure someone does. But I can tell you about Shakespeare, and I know that we were all forced to study him at some point or another. And like, I can tell you about the works of like Van Gogh, and I can like tell you about Brecht's work, and like I can tell you how journalists have toppled whole dictatorships and like let us understand the nature of corruption and everything like that going on in the world around us. And for me, it just points to the innate humanness that the arts and culture has. Like, I think it speaks to our very human spirit, right? I think, like, I remember in high school being kind of resentful when they would tell us that everyone has to do a sport, but they would never mention anything about culture. And although as I've aged, I've come to realize the importance of like doing the sport and having some sort of exercise for the body and everything like that, culture speaks to the mind and the spirit, right? And it fuels those two things. And I think for us not to hold it to the same value that we hold sports, or that we hold our lawyers and our engineers and our academics, is so sad. I mean, law for one, I remember one of my mentors was saying, yeah, the role of Kramer is to break you down before they build you up. And I'm like, okay, so there's a very clear, narrow path for who I'm supposed to be, but there's so much potential to the arts because it speaks to that human spirit and how much potential it holds. So yeah.
Thank you, Edith. Puti, I would like for you to conclude the voice of your panelists, and I would like to ask you, what, as an individual within this arts and culture facility, what is the way forward as an individual of expression?
Just to close off, I'm going to take 1 minute. Arts and culture is, how to go about it is, arts and culture has a very contentious history, a rich, complex history, a debatable history in South Africa. And if you're not careful, 100% sure that this could start crumbling and fading away. I mean, it is ephemeral, it's a fleeting moment. And our duties as arts and culture students or within the spectrum is we need to preserve the legacy and the heritage of our history of our country. We need to preserve it because decades to come, we're not going to remember what happened around this time or what happened earlier. So it's up to us to carry on that legacy, to preserve what our forefathers, our ancestors fought for through the arts and culture, through the freedom of expression, you know, since it was used as a political tool during times of struggle, apartheid. So it's crucial that we observe and just always go back, because arts and culture is forever evolving. It's always getting heightened. It's always moving. So we always need to be on top of our game when it comes to arts and culture. And one way of doing this is to also create more platforms. I could say for university as well, is create more courses involving arts and culture for us to be conscientized and trained within these fields. I mean, it's
Mhm.
so diverse. It's fruitful. There's a lot we could expand off of, rooting from arts and culture that really is not that visible. For example, I in University of Cape Town. It's always about them science and commerce, little to humanities about arts and culture.
Mhm.
We need more platforms to talk about that. So as the youth going forward, I feel like that should be something on our tip top.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Puti. Thank you so much, Puti, for that. On my side, for me, I view the arts and culture sector as the bees. You know, in the ecosystem, you need bees. You know, in order for the ecosystem to have its normal order flow. You know, so I feel as though within all spheres of human interaction, I do feel as though that the arts and culture is a very important field that everyone needs to consider. And I would like to thank my audience for giving our panelists the opportunity to voice their opinions on what they think arts and culture has a role in South Africa. And I'd like to thank Seven Leader for the opportunity given to us to express ourselves, and we'll see you guys on the next episode. Thank you.